I'm CEO of the Chamber, and I'm filling in for Josh Warner today, our Vice Chair of Government Affairs, who just told me he's stuck in a meeting. So let me read his script. Good afternoon and welcome to the fourth ever Policy on Tap discussion hosted by the Greater San Fernando Valley Chamber of Commerce. Over the rest of this year, which I think we only have one or two more of these sessions of Policy on Tap, we're going to bring together government and industry leaders to discuss the pressing issues of the day, from today's topic, which is entertainment, to transportation, tourism, and more. We want to hear about what's working and what isn't, what can be done better and how, and discuss some big ideas for the future of the Greater San Fernando Valley Chamber, or San Fernando Valley. Today, we have two amazing guest speakers who will be discussing the topic of entertainment and sorry, Scott, I have the old script. Entertainment technology. Paul Audley, President of Film LA, and Tom Stilling, Vice President of Digital Research at Forrester. They will be joined by our moderator and former Chamber Board Chair, Cindy Keitel. Before I turn it over to Cindy, I want to acknowledge our sponsors, Cal Lutheran University and SoCal Gas. Their support has made Policy on Tap possible since the beginning of the pandemic. And we are at, by the way, Policy on Tap is supposed to be at a brewery where you get your drink on tap. So hopefully our next one, we're actually going to have some real drinks on tap. And so I thank you to them because that will help us actually have it in person. And I want to thank you, Cindy, and turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Nancy. I want to be sure you can all hear me adequately, that we've done a sound test. So
what's up, everybody?
All right. Okay, so before we begin, I want to explain today's format. Each speaker has been asked to give remarks on their industry for 10 minutes, and they're going to be talking about the state of entertainment, the entertainment industry specifically in the San Fernando Valley and the greater Los Angeles area. We're going to be talking about the response to the pandemic and what the path to recovery is going to look like. Now, we have a bell. We're going to ring it if you go past your 10-minute time limit, so speakers know their time frame and that it's about to come to a close. So following the presentation, I'm going to conduct a Q&A with our speakers, and each will have 2 minutes to answer the question. Time permitting, we'll also take questions from all of you, audience, via the chat window. Now, while the panel is speaking, could you all put yourself on mute? Because I know there's a lot of dogs and cats out there that just might be barking or wanting your attention while you're watching Zoom. I know that happens to me frequently. So with that, first, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Paul Audley, who's president of Film LA. Paul helps to streamline and enhance the on-location filming process for communities and content creators to help ensure that the entertainment industry in Los Angeles continues to grow and thrive. And he's also the longest serving president of Film LA. And previously, he's very distinguished. He was the mayor of Fairfield, Connecticut. What's that all about? We'll have to ask you some questions on that. Chief of Staff to Congressman Christopher Shays, Deputy Secretary of State for the state of Connecticut, and Public Affairs Manager for the City of Scottsdale, Arizona. So you moved a couple times before landing in LA.
Going west.
Yeah, so with that, Paul, it's all yours.
Well, thanks. Thank you, Cindy, and thank you for the invitation today from the Chamber. For those of you who aren't familiar with Film LA, because you've never seen one of our blue notices on your door or seen film crews out there, Film LA is a nonprofit organization that's under contract to the city of LA, the county of LA for unincorporated areas, and 14 other cities and 6 school districts in greater Los Angeles to serve as their film office. And so most of the activity that Film LA does is around creating permits and getting logistics cleared so that filming can happen on location around the region. In addition to that, we have a huge outreach function to keep the community both aware and friendly to filming when it's in its neighborhoods. And so we have 4 people full-time who are proactively involved with communities where filming happens fairly often. We have field service folks who are out there monitoring film sets to make sure there is compliance and to handle problems. And we have a group called Solution Services for the industry and for the community to help them plan, to let them know where there are going to be problems, and to help them find alternatives to sites that may be getting overused right now. We're the marketing arm for this region to bring filmmaking to LA. When I first started almost 13 years ago, we called it runaway and then ran away production because so much had left the region. We've seen some great improvements since then with the advent of the California Film and Tax Credit. And finally, the last piece of the business that Film LA does is a thing called Attract and Retain. And what that's really about is helping people become part of this industry. And so for more than a decade, Film LA has been supporting underrepresented film communities through sponsoring activities, film festivals, forums, and other things for groups like NALIP, which is Latino Film Festival, Pan-African, Women in Film, Red Nation Film Festival, and Skin Fest for Indigenous people, Outfest for an LGBTQA community. Because these are the communities that now are getting great attention and have needed it for a long time. You may wonder about what happened to the industry during COVID last March when things shut down. It shut down for a full quarter. Absolutely no filming took place in greater Los Angeles last spring into June. There was absolutely nothing. So everything shut down completely. And when you realize that there are over 164,000 direct jobs in this industry, and it is the third largest economic driver for Los Angeles County, you can see how serious that cut in production was. It began to return very slowly in June when some of the restrictions were lifted, but not fully as the unions and guilds and studios and producers came to terms with how they would act on sets, in addition to those things being set by the state and county health departments. And so by September and October, we were seeing things come back to about 60% of normal. And then the holidays hit, and many of us were not so responsible, and COVID began to spread. And by January, we were in a near shutdown again of the industry. The good news is that even before the full reopening this June, we were back at normal levels of filming in our region, but interestingly, some different areas of filming. So where we have become a TV center and a commercials center, an independent film center, we are now seeing for the first time in several years, multiple large budget films in Los Angeles happening here. I don't think that's going to be permanent, but we're seeing them here because some of the places where they have gone to chase tax credits are currently still in pretty severe lockdown from COVID. And so they're here because they can and do work, and they can't take advantage of those incentives in those other countries. So what we're seeing too is that part of our research arm has been reporting for years about the fact that we're running out of space for the film industry here, which is great news. While we are leading the world in stage space, there's over 5.2 million square feet of certified stage space in Los Angeles. It's 95 to 98% occupied. And we've been talking about that for several years, and now we're seeing some changes. We know that the government has come forward with a proposal that if it gets passed, will add some incentives to building stages. But the private sector has been using our data to build new stages. And so we have on the books now and getting ready to go in Television City, a $1.25 billion project that'll add 7 new stages plus support for those stages. Echelon Studios is going to spend $450 million, adding 5. Atlas is doing in the old LA Times printing press a $650 million project, which will add 17 stages over time. And so this industry is now spread out into the construction industry to add jobs and economic benefit. And in the Valley, since in the last 3 years, Crimson opened in Chatsworth 5 stages. Quixote in their North Valley stages in Pacoima added 5. And soon Quixote will be adding more at their Pacoima facility and an additional 2 in Sylmar. You should also probably know, you probably talk about this regularly, that a large number of the folks who work in the film industry are Valley residents. It is the most populous area for our folks who work in the industry. And so it's been a critical part of us keeping them working, employed, and keeping things going on the road. So we're very, very thrilled with that. One of the things that we found from Beacon Economics study this year is that the average wage for a worker in the film industry is $98,800. And because we have this number of people working, we have the biggest and best cast and crew in the world in Los Angeles, making it still one of the most attractive places to film. I'm going to stop because I think it'll leave us more time for questions, and we'll leave it open for that for now. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Paul. Now, our next speaker is Tom Stilling. He's Vice President of Digital Research at Forrester. Tom is known as a thought leader and a speaker on digital content, media supply chain, and customer journeys at Forrester. At Forrester, he manages a team embracing the rapid evolution of customer and content expectations. Previously, he was an executive at 20th Century Fox, where he built a global organization overseeing digital and physical product planning and launches for film and TV products. Tom is going to talk to us today about how the pandemic impacted people and how they consume entertainment and whether there's any going back to the way things were before. Tom?
Thank you. No, and thank you to the Chamber for inviting me to come visit. I very much miss certain parts of Santa Monica. The fact that I never looked at a weather report for 15 years was amazing. And as I look outside here in Salem, Massachusetts, I do appreciate the rain, but the snow not as much. So thank you again for having me. Part of my role at Fox and part of my role afterwards at a startup and now at Forrester is we always want to be aware about how customers, consumers are consuming content. And so just to talk a little bit about the what, who, where, why, when, and some of the impact that pandemic has had on all of us as we consume media. And one of the top lines is, and I know one of the questions talked about, like, is there any going back? One of the truisms that comes out in the data and that comes out in interviews and sort of anecdotally is that pandemic, if nothing else, deepened our need for distractions. And so we are always looking towards games, towards movies, towards TV. We're looking towards interactivity. We're looking towards to consume content in a variety of different ways. And that's even more true than it has been in the past. And when you look at the data in 2021 and you think about what percentage of people are more interested in distraction, it's actually 20–30% higher. So I know that that sounds a little bit diffuse, but if you think about that, there's a limited amount of hours in a week. And when we talk about how many hours are already consumed by media and by TV and film, that's actually that's great news for the entertainment industry and for content creators in general. People not only want to be distracted after some initial bumps in the first 6 to 12 months, there was a lot of changes in how content was presented. And so you can see some trends that were already in effect getting bigger, and you could see new trends arrive that have changed the game. And so that's a little bit of the setup, but just to go back to, like, there is such a need for content consumption, so that will never go away. The question is, what's the right fit for that content and what do people want to see? So when you think about trends and what's accelerated in terms of general content, gaming was already there. And if you look at the revenue that the industry produces, if you look at the consoles that are sold, and if you look at just the sheer software, the connectivity, the TikToks, the blogs, everything related to gaming, massive explosion. You had people at home, away from the outdoors where bad things could happen, focusing more and more, not just for those players that were already involved, but also for the ones that hadn't become gamers that maybe caught something online and they were super interested by it. And so then they joined gaming even more, and that leads to even more consumption of media. The other big shift that we've seen is virtual reality. So when I was at Fox, virtual reality, we would work on big ticket items, say like Alien, space, fanboy, fangirl movies, and you'd have virtual reality as a supplement to the primary content stream that you were putting out to the market. Now what you see is whole neighborhood sessions, and friends of mine in LA and friends who respond to surveys and others talk about how they can be very happy sitting in the comfort of their room, meeting 50, 100 people at mixers, at social hours, moving through a virtual world, going to virtual dances. I actually think, and I forget the statistic, but the number of in living room incidents for people who have forgotten they're in their living room and are dancing and grooving to an amazing dance party while tables are shattering around them, that's real. And that there was a significant uptake. So again, people are looking for distractions, and there's a lot of different ways that they're going to find them. In parallel to that moment, X months into pandemic, depending on where you're living in what region, there is more than a quarter of the US population are actually fatigued from watching so much TV and film. And people are putting down media, they're putting down some of their gaming consoles, they're picking up books, they're staring out the window, or like myself and others, you've adopted a COVID puppy and you're seeking something more tactile, something that's more real near you rather than just consuming media. And so that moment in almost seems like it's a dichotomy. So you have one group of humans who are moving forward and saying, yes, more media consumption. And you have another one that have had a short-term spike and they actually want less. And so that's real. The time that you see people online in terms of the how are we consuming it is it's definitely online, not offline. So back in the day when DVDs, and I think I asked someone under a certain age what a DVD was and they laughed and they said, my parents have them on the wall. That's physical, that's offline. How many hours a week are we actually consuming content? Well, the highest number has been 1 to 4 hours, but the accelerated group of humans that are watching content and consuming content is now actually 5 to 9 hours. So if you think about, I am just coming back, maybe I'm in remote, maybe I'm hybrid, maybe I'm driving again. I am choosing almost double amount of the time to potentially consume content. So another accelerator of change that has come out of the last 18 months. And when you ask who are you actually watching it with, I don't know if anyone had a pod, but social pods were real. So my household and your household, we've all been vaccinated, or at least we're isolating together as a group. You come on over to my living room, and now I've got 6, 8, maybe 9 people in my viewing pod, and I'm viewing one of the major streaming channels. And again, not favoritism, but just calling out the ones that we know, whether it's Disney, Netflix, you've got Hulu, you've got a lot of different options. And so pods started forming and going to people's houses that were considered safe and secure. And that behavior looks like it may continue, especially for younger generation who are in their 20s and 30s, and being social and going out has become more cemented in their behavior patterns. So pods being at home versus watching theaters and public spaces where you're not sure what's in the air or what's on the chairs. And then just in terms of how and where, if we are going to go out, we want to make it bigger. We want to make it more eventized. We definitely are looking for some more bells and whistles and reasons to go back out. There's sort of this slingshot effect, like so many people have been at home, they've been spending time with their friends and family, with their loved ones, with their animals, everything else. And there's going to be this burst and flurry of activity. And you see it in the economic numbers, in the price indexes, and how people are going out. And that consumption for a period of time will flatten the streaming curve because people will go out again. And then I think there's going to be a balance. And so I think the question, if you're working in any part of the industry or an adjacent one, is what do we think that balance could look like? And how do I take advantage of what is going to become what many commentators have called the new normal, and this hybrid consumption of data? So a couple of remarks on the who, what, where, and when, and then looking forward to Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much, Tom. And thank you to both of our amazing panelists. We're going to give you a real round, or in most of the cases, virtual applause. So thank you for your comments. I'd like to start off with our questions now, and each speaker will have 2 minutes to answer a question. And we do have a bell. If you go on and on and on, we've had some civic leaders on that we've had to ring the bell quite a lot in order to bring the question to a close. So
Paul and I are well behaved.
Yes.
even though I come from a government background, I don't know.
Yeah, Paul, I'm not sure about you, but we'll see. Well, we have the bell ready just in case. So I'm going to ask a few just off the wall questions to get started. First off, my question's for Tom. Are you ever confused with the Ninja Warrior, Thomas Stillings?
I get confused with the weatherman Thomas Skilling, who I vaguely resemble in dim light, but I have not been confused with a ninja warrior in some time.
Great. Well, that was a surprise question, so I'm glad you were prepared for that one. I also have another question for you, Tom, before we go on.
Mhm.
Is there a trend in larger televisions based on what you're describing as pods?
So what's interesting is that there is a trend with larger televisions. However, there is also a physical limit to that which you can put into one living room. And I think as you watch price drops for retail of TV, $1,200 can buy you excellent HD quality nowadays as compared to even 18, 24 months ago. And bigger is not always better. What you find is that even in semi-large spaces in private homes, if you have a 56, 64-inch, like at a certain point, it's the land of diminishing returns. Where you see the switchover point is actually to projections, where people are projecting against an entire wall, which has been made plain. And so there's this interesting inverse bell curve where actually the larger TV, once you get to a certain point, you see sales decline. And then there's a drop-off point, but then you have projectors being installed for full wall viewing with amazing surround systems. And you can definitely see an uptick in activity around there.
Great. We were all wondering whether to buy big TVs. It sounds like we need the projectors now. We need to go into that. So,
I have a large screen that I put on the side of my house, and last year we had a new HD projector, and so our projection space, I think it was 12 feet wide. So, and that was an excellent welcome to a COVID mask wearing movie party environment.
okay, and now I have a question for Paul. This is time for puppy or kitty reveal. Do you have an animal near you that you could introduce to us?
Well, you're going to make me wake him up, and then God knows what's going to happen to us afterward. Come here, Wally. That's Wally.
Oh, very nice.
Welcome, Wally.
Okay, go back to sleep.
And Tom, do you have an animal you'd like to introduce to us?
Mine is slightly larger and will not lift easily, but Murphy does wish you all hello.
Awesome. All right, now, seriously, back to Paul, we're going to ask you some questions about Film LA. With local regulations and in what we see as sometimes soaring costs hampering the entertainment production industry, did Los Angeles see an increase in runaway productions to other cities, states, and countries that were perhaps less restrictive? And that's, of course, during the pandemic.
In general, people talk about this a lot. The reality of it is that unless you're going to another major production center of the world, like a Vancouver or London, and you're only bringing your director and your star there, it costs you more to leave LA with a full cast, crew, camera operators, all of your equipment. And so the only reason people really have done this chasing away has been because other entities around the world have offered the money to do it. And so we haven't seen it based on some of the things that are happening here as much as it is the fact that they get money back. If you're going to get a third of your budget back to go to Georgia or to go to London, it makes sense to go through all the effort, transfer the people, pay their hotel bills, bring your equipment. But there's a lot of other places, not so much. If you're a very small budget film, they don't go that far away, but they may go to other parts of California where there's very little filming and very little restriction. But we have not seen it except related to the tax credit programs and refund programs.
Okay, it's all about the money. It's not about the COVID then.
Yep.
Okay.
Well, actually, and you had the question about COVID, and the reality was what we saw was actually it impacted people coming here more than it impacted people leaving us, because we had a quarantine period. And the same thing happened here. People who worked in LA really couldn't travel to the places they might have otherwise, because they'd be 2 weeks not working before they could start working with all those people. And so COVID, I think, pretty much made everybody stationary more than they've been in a decade, more than anything else. And because so much happens here, they stayed.
Okay. All right, Tom, back to you for a question. And we're going to go back to that streaming that you talked about. So over the past few years, the number of streaming services has proliferated with so many like Disney Plus, Paramount Plus, Discovery Plus, and many more I'm sure that you could name. Is it possible, do you think, to have too many streaming services? And do you think this trend is going to continue? That there's going to continue to be more competition in this zone?
So definitely more competition. And just to add a yes and moment to that, it's competition from not just big players, but from niche, from medium size and small players. One of the truisms of pandemic is that thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of people have become content creators. And so they're on these services, they're doing 15-second, 3-minute, 5-minute, 6-minute clips. They're exploding, whether they're talking about their personal lives or their small business or, you know, some other entity. You have an explosion of services, and whether we realize it or not, we are consuming off of a variety of streaming services, whether they are paid for, ad supported, or free, because some of that is blurring so much in our day-to-day lives. So if you think about what sites that you went to today, maybe you went to a news site, maybe you went to an entertainment site, you checked out the neighborhood blog, you probably stopped by your social media, and then you consciously chose to watch 3 hours on a paid-for streaming service. You might only register those 3 hours as the streaming, but what you actually saw through the entire course of the day is big to small to individual creators influencing what you see. So that's, I think, a really interesting sort of trend that people sometimes floats underneath the surface. But in terms of maximum number of streaming services, I think a visual I saw from a different company that was sort of funny is you should just have the dial on the TV, and then you can rotate through all of your streaming services again. So like if you grew up in the New York City area, it was 2, 4, 5, 7, 9, 13, 2, 4, 5, 7, 9. So 6. What was it in LA?
11 and 13. No,
11. We missed 11.
Yeah, missed 11, right?
WPIX.
WPIX. I would never miss it. They had Godzilla on Sundays. But if you think about it, 7 channels, and then you look at where the trends are, there is depending on the survey, a high degree of consumer comfort with 5 to 7 streaming services, and then it tends to decline a little bit. What always wins is good content. So I think people, yes, there are streaming services, and there's probably a natural or an organic, level of what we're willing to pay for, which is one input. And the other one is, if the content is good, the people will come if they can find it. So yes, there's a limit. I think a practical limit that we've reached, and it's probably declining. I think the other reality is production costs are so high, marketing costs are so high, organizations, there's a natural probably moment coming soon where more of the streaming services are going to come together. And so where you've had an explosion of major players, you'll probably, as you've seen some of this already happening, have that sort of get less and less. And you'll end up with what was prophesized a couple of years ago, the big 3, the big 4 controlling a significant portion of the market. But there will always be these smaller content creators and individuals, and their percentage of ad revenue, of merch, of everything else, it continues to grow.
Yeah, I think that somewhat answered my next question, was about what's going to happen with overlapping audiences of content. So your view is that they will merge?
I think some of that will. I think for the major players, you'll likely see more compact industry in the time ahead. I think that the eyes after 18 months of staring at TV and at laptops, we are going to have a rebound or a rubber band moment where for a minute, it's going to be sort of tough to figure out where people are going to net out. And I think as lives return to much more social, the longer term impact is going to be somewhere in the middle. We're comfortable with this number of streaming services, and we also don't mind being dazzled by some of the smaller creators. Myself, I'm not sure where that will net out, but you can see that play out in the next 12 months for sure.
Great, thank you. And Paul, my next question is for you, and you've answered it to some extent, but I'm going to do a little different take on it. California's lost approximately 300,000 jobs in the creative industries. Many businesses and other sectors are really struggling, and I mean struggling, like food services, to find workers now that we're reopening. Is there any niche, any part of the entertainment industry that is facing similar challenges to bring people back to work?
Well, yeah, there is. I think it's all industries are having this issue. The Public Policy Institute of California said that the film area was down 33% in its jobs as of April. We didn't see that here. We were hearing from some of the unions and guilds that they were short people. They were bringing people into the unions because they didn't have enough to do the work. I have 10 openings I'm having trouble filming. So at filmla.com, work for us, go check that out. So I think it is true that that all over the place it is, and you should be looking at the different crafts and unions in particular. They're the ones I'm hearing from that are saying we need more bodies. So yeah, we're trying to fill the holes too, back in from when the pandemic lost a lot of folks.
Yeah, there's a whole sector of the, I would call it, I guess, like a career pathway for students in the San Fernando Valley to go into the film industry. And it seems like we need more attention to that area. If you foresee more openings coming with more studios opening in the future.
Yeah, and I think, one of the good things about the California Film and Television Tax Credit is it requires people receiving that credit to do something for those people who are trying to get into the industry and for students. So they should be tapping into that program to make sure they're on that referrals list.
Great, thank you. Well, Tom, we're back to you, and we're going to be talking about broadband access. So what challenges, such as maybe broadband access, remain for the broader deployment of digital distribution of entertainment?
The short list.
Yeah, it could be a long list.
Well, so there's one thing that I find personally interesting that you can tell has changed. So if you think about retail space and being in a Wi-Fi and what level of access you have when you are in a coffee shop or in a restaurant or in a library or museum, I think initially over the years, it's become accepted that if I'm going to go out and sit somewhere, I should have Wi-Fi service to check email. I think what you see developing, and one of the challenges is, if we want to change behavior, and if you want people to embrace retail, they need a higher level of access when they're somewhere else, when they're not just home or in a certain region or a certain part. And I think that when you get to places like that coffee shop that you always go to on the corner, if you wanted to watch the news and it's not coming in because you've got 50 other people there, there could be an opportunity for retail shops to adjust to that reality, that if someone has made the choice to go out and that they want to watch broadband and they want to do it on a personal device, whether it's a phone or whether a laptop, then they're going to need the broadband to do that. And so I think you've got this older mindset of, we'll just put up a small one and say we have Wi-Fi. And I think what you're really looking at is, if you're going to survive in that space and you want to draw people in and have them sit and not just do takeaway and leave, you're going to have to give some incentives, and that's part of it. I think overall for broadband, when you look at price plans across the country and you look, there's like two things that come to mind. One is we were all held captured. So I don't know about your local broadband provider, but mine has not been offering me any Wi-Fi discounts in the last 18 months. I absolutely know I am sitting at home, that I am connected, and the charges have started reeling in, right? So that's real, and that has some longer term implications. But I think what has still been undone, and which is a challenge, is that you still have large swaths of the country which do not have consistent and reliable broadband access. And that is very real. You know, when you think about, like, I'm in the Boston metro area, LA metro, where there's, you know, maybe a majority of users and humans that are looking at, you're missing whole swaths of the country. And so I think that from a media penetration perspective, the more broadband access you can have both in local and retail, and also in some of these areas that are underserved, could be just a boost for either further streaming and further content consumption. But we haven't done a lot with that. It's interesting. It's similar to me to other, like in my own mind, of other capital infrastructure improvements that could have happened in the last 18 months and maybe didn't. So it was nice to hear, for example, Paul talking about all the amazing stuff going on in LA. That, I think, is more the exception than the rule, which is very surprising. If you think about, there was an opportunity to move forward on so many areas And was it taken is the question.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to move over to Paul for the next question. Paul, with film production in Los Angeles returning to pre-pandemic levels, what challenges does Film LA face in facilitating the process of permitting for on-location filming and production? And I'm thinking specifically of My Film LA. What's going on there?
Yeah. So, well, first, Thomas, thank you for the segue into this, because one of the challenges we're facing in sort of a microcosm situation is that the Department of Public Works in Los Angeles accelerated many of their programs for street work and other things, to the point that we've had trouble locating people. There's so much going on, and in particular in downtown, where they're doing mass transit construction. So the roads are torn up, they're changing lanes into busted pedestrian areas, and they've rapidly accelerated a program that was supposed to take place over a decade. So it's all good news. It's great news for the city. It's been difficult for us in downtown. The other parts that we're having a challenge with are the constant changes in pandemic rules for the film industry. And the county has now pulled them all back, but the industry itself is still struggling with new rules under the new set of circumstances. And so we're having to maintain and monitor those and educate and put things onto our permits we never had to put on before. And so that's happening. And then also we have, with more production, of course, we have more people who are complaining and agitated and having to remind the industry after all this time about being a good neighbor when you go back into neighborhoods. But on My Film LA, this is the new operating system that will go completely switched over on August 9th this year. We've spent several $1 million bringing geographic information systems into our permit system so that we know what's going on with things like construction, road reservations. You can do all kinds of things we weren't able to do before, including searching a region for issues like complaints, which we attach to addresses and all kinds of things. So My Film LA will be a new replacement of our current online permit system that'll be more flexible, hopefully easier to use once you get into it, and have great new opportunities both for our staff, the approvers in the cities and county, and those using it to get more information about where they're going and the status of their applications. So August 9th, full switch over. We're inviting people now who may have a permit to ask to start now, since it's ready. And we're in phases of teaching people. But as of August 9th, the old system will be gone and the new one will be active.
Great. What are some of the benefits by going automated with your new technology? What are the benefits you anticipate?
Well, we've been an all online permit system for a long time, but the new system, really the major things that it does is we've used the industry to help us redesign that system so that we're making sure that the critical pieces are available to them up front. But in particular, it's this hook into history around that permit and that neighborhood through the geographic information system and those overlays. We used to have a separate finance system. It's now part of that. So clients can come in and check the status of their bills, of their own records and history. So it is unified varying systems that we had present into a single system and overlaid it with geographic information. So, if you want to know if you're going to be going into a fire zone, which means you're going to have to hire a fire safety officer, you will be able to tell that now instead of having to ask us.
Are we all fire zones? That's what my question is. Seems like it.
There's official ones and there's where we are today. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Paul,
Great.
in terms of unsolicited hope or compliments, I have several friends that are line producers that are eager for your system and looking forward to it.
Yeah, well, if they call you, let them know August 9th, that's the date it goes fully live. So they can start now, but it goes fully live August 9th.
It's
Very
great
nice.
to see new things coming out of the pandemic, isn't it? I mean, that we're coming out of it and we're going to have new technologies and things moving forward. It gives people hope and also something to think about when they want to watch their movies.
And Cindy, really, this credit for this goes back generations to when the city and county decided to create a private nonprofit to do this work, because I don't think either government could have built the resources up to be able to do this level of work, to put this kind of system in place to manage this massive workload. We're the largest film office in the world and we get no government funding. So this is all funded by the film industry to do what they need to do to operate effectively in Los Angeles.
Great. Well, congratulations on it. We look forward to hearing great things about it.
Thanks.
I want to add a question on top of that question, and that has to do with local governments. And for you, Tom, maybe it's more any government if you're looking at streaming services anywhere in the country. But the question really is, what advice and what would you say to any kind of city or county or even state at this point that productions companies need to recover and prosper? And so either one of you, go ahead and start.
Well, for us, what we know is necessary is that they have to be able to move quickly and efficiently in a short time period to get their permissions, approvals, and logistics accomplished. And so we are on a 2 to 3 day typically turnaround time here. I think the thing that helps when any film commission asks me this same question is you have to have somebody available who's an expert in the community to help with planning that production. And so we have a free service called Production Planning in our Solution Services Department that helps pre-work all of this, has deep knowledge about what's going on in the neighborhoods, has access to all of the city and county facilities in a site called Loco Scout. The city's facilities are almost all free to film in, which helps a lot too. And so creating libraries, creating easy to use materials and rapid turnaround, critical for the recovery of the industry to be able to get back to work.
Great, thank you. And Tom, what's your wish list for cities, counties, and even states?
I love the description. I think it was so concise about this, like the how-to guide of where you get help. I think that speaks to the fact that so often institutional / production knowledge is lost. And when people move on to other gigs or other roles, and in the last 18 months, you've seen so many families and just jobs shift that calling your friend Paul or calling your friend Cindy or calling Scott is maybe not as possible. And so I think what governments and states and organizations need to do is very similar to what Paul outlined: build out structures so that people can go to a place instead of relying on this sort of institutional knowledge that sort of comes and goes. And it recognizes just the human break. There's been 18 months of disruption in lives and family and jobs. You're not always going to be able to call the same human that you knew on the ground that could help you get a thing or help you with craft services. You're going to need some other context. So I think the more that communities and governments can put that into a central location and upload that into databases that are easily accessible, the better and faster they'll recover.
Great, thank you. We just have 2 questions left for our panel, and then we will pivot over to questions from our audience. So audience, please put questions in now so we can be ready for you in just a couple of questions from now. So let me go back to, let's see, Tom, I believe I have one for you. Just as the writer's strike 20 years ago led to an explosion in a new genre of reality TV, do you see this pandemic having some kind of inflection point in how people consume entertainment? I mean, shifting away from movie theaters and live TV to streaming. And do you think, if so, will it be permanent?
So there is a lot in that question.
There is a lot. Let's start with the first part. Let's start with the first part. Part 1. Do you expect there to be a new genre coming out of the fact that, you know, there's this explosion as it happened 20 years ago with the writer's strike? Do you think something is going to come out?
And I remember I was at Fox. Fox was having protests against it for one of the writer's strikes. And it did generate a lot more reality TV, scripted, you know, started moving away. You started seeing movie talent going into TV roles going to unscripted, like everything started shifting. I think what you're seeing right now goes back to my earlier remark. Individual content creators have exploded, and they've been helped along by companies that reward you for having 30, 60, 100,000 viewers. If you are an individual content creator and you can do I'll just say a Facebook promotion or maybe a Netflix promotion, not a Netflix, a Facebook or a TikTok promotion, and you can hit 1.2 million views for your gaming show, you are onto something. And so because of the energy around these independent and smaller content creators, you've absolutely changed because the eyeballs on that are shifting. And so to connect it to my comment earlier about like during the course of a day, you are seeing content that's created by a lot of different entities, and this is just going to continue to grow.
Right. And then this shift, do you think it's permanent, the move to the streaming?
I think there's going to be a little bit of that rubber band effect where you're going to see a surge of people going out. And again, it's going to sort of go back, and people are very comfortable with streaming. They're very comfortable with the pod concept, with staying at home, or it depends on the product. So if there is a good product and good content, people will go to it. And so whether it's physical, a destination that you go to at the local mall, or whether it's your living room with the 3 houses that live near you coming over, good product and good content always wins. So my personal view is I think there's a little bit of a hybrid moment coming, and it depends on how theaters and streaming services react to it. So I'm a little bit unsure myself where I think it will end up, but it all comes down to good content. People follow that content.
Right. We're about to enter into 2 questions that are online, but I just want to do a follow-up question about streaming services. People seem to think that it produces less revenue for the studios than the theatrical releases. Is that true? And how can the studios make digital and streaming work for them economically?
It's interesting. So it's definitely true, and it's known that if you go back to cable TV, and sort of original SVOD days, the contracts between content creators and broadcasters are very different than the ones today. You had a lot of minimum guarantees, you had set costs, you had a lot of price, and now you move into much more of a rev share model. So, if you look at some of the services that are out there right now, if it's 70-30 or 60-40 split, with 60 and 70 going back to the content producer and 30% going to the streaming service, it depends on the size and who you're playing with. Is it equitable and is it fair? It all depends on the individual contracts. It has shifted though, and so that's a real, it's not a barrier, but is a real factor in deciding whether you produce a series or produce a movie, because of who else downstream will be taking a cut of it.
Okay, great. Well, we have a few questions rolling in. I'm going to move back to Paul for, and you may even see it in the chat, but I'll read it to you. How difficult does LA still make permits in filming compared to Georgia, overseas? And is COVID affecting overseas production for US companies and their employees? And then I'll have to read these one at a time for you. Are employees concerned to go overseas? So first question was, how difficult does LA make permits in filming compared to Georgia or overseas?
Yeah. So, the film permit here is not hard to get. As I said, we can turn it around and typically we ask for 72 hours in advance of filming. In order to make that happen, obviously more complex takes longer. Because LA is in the region is so heavily filmed, we will work constantly to make sure that you know exactly how to do it and how to make it work. The interesting thing for me is how often we find a studio exec has told another city or state to call Film LA to ask how they do what they do because it's so efficient. And so while we hear complaints from people in LA about how, you make it so hard, I'm not sure that it's really any easier elsewhere when you go until you get to some of those communities where it's basically do anything you want. We don't know how to work this for the first film. On the COVID question, yes, a lot of the regions that we would normally see people from LA going to film are still having real lockdown situations or quarantine situations, which have prevented filmmakers from going back to those other jurisdictions that have, in the past attracted them with financial resources. So Great Britain, Australia, some of the other English-speaking countries. Canada's doing pretty well, but yeah, people are concerned about traveling now, in particular to those countries that have not yet really gotten a handle on this virus.
Okay, thank you. That was from Gary Burns. Thank you, Gary, for that question. And then let's see, Richie Burrell has a question. Is the future going to be episodic shows or movies, and will the mix change? And I probably, Tom, I would assume you might have that question unless Paul, you don't want to weigh in on that.
I think you definitely see, if you look at where the money goes, you can definitely see that episodic in any medium has surged for good and for bad. And that whether the content surge is of quality or not, we leave to individual viewers and tastes. But episodic fits the environment, whether it's 23 minutes, 45, whatever that is. If it's a web series that runs at 15 minutes a clock, we have been trained as consumers to expect and to desire episodic content. We also want big bang moments. And so the question becomes, and I saw another question talking about the drama series, The Queen. Like, if you are used to an episodic show where drama happens over X number of episodes, 12, 13, 14, whatever the number is, does the Downton Abbey 2 movie appeal to you as much? And I think there is room for both, but you can see that episodic has definitely changed the percentage and revenue game, particularly during pandemic.
Right, and Gary had another question, Gary Burns, and I love this question. Is anyone going to buy the Cinerama movie theater? I think there's a please in that. Please, is anyone going to buy the Cinerama movie theater? And is there a resistance to certain demographics to going back to the movie theater? So 2 very different questions. Either one of you, if you
I think we need to Google this, but I think that the theaters were purchased or in line to be purchased. But I can't confirm that. I remember reading that there was someone on the hook to go forward with it, but I don't know if it closed or not.
I don't know if it had a buyer for that specific one. I think they had a buyer for the chain.
Yeah.
Right, that was why I asked the question. The last I heard was the Cinerama was owned by the movie company, and that's why, and they owned the land as well. That's why it wasn't able to just be sold. That's why I want to know if anybody knew anything about it.
Not past that, but thanks for the question. I'll see if we can find out for you. I do have a research department, so we'll ask.
We would love to know that. We want to hold a gala or do some things there. That would be an awesome place for us to be. And there was another question. Is there any demographics that are really, really resistant to going back to the movie theater?
So it's interesting. I think I'll rephrase that a little bit and say, are there demographics that are less inclined, maybe not so much resistant? And I think what you're seeing is the younger demographic that knows devices, that grew up on this since they were 2 years old, that were very much aware. You're seeing less inclination in sort of that, 18 to 25, 26-year-old jet set to go back to theaters. And interestingly enough, also concerned about health. And then you see it on the opposite side, which is if you are in an older demographic, why the health risk, and is it really safe? And so you've got this sort of interesting mix of, 60s, 55 plus, like, maybe not so much, and less inclined. And then all of these younger adults that have done pods and are used to streaming, movies are less ingrained in some of their cultural mindset. Movies in theaters are less ingrained.
And yet, didn't we see Black Widow do extremely well this weekend? And I didn't know what demographic went to see it, but it's the best performing movie in a year and a half.
So Black Widow fanboys are their own class of humans. They defy all trends. They will always go see, and I will always go see a movie like Black Widow. So, yeah.
We have one more question here from Darnell Tyler. And Darnell, welcome. He just happens to be from NBC Universal, so be careful how you answer this question. With the explosion of streaming content, there is a need for additional studio production space. And I know you spoke before about more being built around LA. Well, what about staged investment in other locations like Louisiana, Georgia, New Mexico, et cetera?
So our soundstage study, which we produce, will be coming out again this year with an update. But what we know right now is we know this stage is being built in several locations in Canada. Britain's doing some expansion. I don't know if there's more happening in Georgia. There was a lot on the books before the pandemic started, and I don't have an update on whether they went forward or going forward. But people from all over the world have been calling our research folks asking for the data we have on stage space and occupancy around the world. So it's a crunch in many, many places. And so I think you're going to continue to see that expansion of stage space as we move ahead.
Great. I see two more questions. You may see them all as well in the chat. One is called, "What's your opinion on reboots?" From one of our friends from the chamber, Ruff.
From the point of view of Film LA, which promotes making films, reboots are just fine.
Yeah, I think from a personal perspective, I love good reboots, and I'll even watch a bad reboot for a little while. But I suspect that interest is always going to be there. People have nostalgia, and they want to see it come back again. I think a great example of that, and no one laughed, but if you watched, I think it was Netflix, what is it, Sabrina the Teenage Witch, or I forget what that was. That was a reboot of The
Chilling Adventures of Sabrina. Not that I know.
Thank you.
Personally.
Yes. Thank you. So The Chilling Adventures, but that was a reboot of that wonderful sitcom, or, the sitcom, which was much more like complete retake on that, similar to Archie, Riverdale, right? And all those shows. Again, it always comes back to the quality of the content. If a reboot is good, amen. If it's bad, like, I don't know, should we reboot Love Boat? Does anyone remember Love Boat? I don't know.
Well, and a lot of the thing that we've seen too is a trend.
Are you referring to the Love Boat with Robert Urich?
Yeah. Nice reference,
One of the
yes.
things we've seen
That was bad.
in the reboot trend has been to reboot using underrepresented community in the roles, which has been a way of getting more people exposed and seeing people like them on TV. So there's been a benefit to reboots in that sense as well.
Yeah, there's a great question here also from Scott Schmidt that was further up in the chat here. With the rise of individual content creators, is Film LA seeing more people trying to film without permits? And how would an individual content creator know what they need to do?
So yes, we do see an uptick in unpermitted filming happening around. People are so sophisticated with seeing our blue notices that look a lot like that sign, that if they see filming and they don't have one of those on their door 2 days before, they're calling to let us know. The two things I want to say about it. The first is they should always call and ask for our free services production planning to lead a new filmmaker through the process of what they do and don't have to do and how to do it most economically. Our job is to help them make it as cheaply as possible as they're entering the market. And the other thing is, with this new system, My Film LA, we'll be able to do some really good data gathering about work effort to produce permits. And we'll be able to then start talking about perhaps scaling the permit cost based on the work effort to produce that permit for the city and Film LA. So I'm looking forward to that happening. We did do a trial at the request of the mayor with content producers who did small short-term content on low budget. And we found them not using the system because it had restrictions about what they could do without a permit because of things like creating public alarm or needing to have traffic control and other things. So we'll be working on that as we move forward. But right now, call our production planning people and let them help you make it happen.
Great. Well, I want to thank you both, and I want to turn it over to Nancy to see if she has an additional question and also to wrap up our event for today. Well done. Thank you both, Tom and Paul, for your comments today.
Sure.
Thank you both for being here. I thought it was a great conversation.